Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to today's webinar, Climate Deception on Air, Mapping Climate Disinformation in French and Brazilian Mainstream Media. My name is Inès Gentil. I'm a project officer at EU DisinfoLab. Before we begin, we will start with a few reminders. First of all, the call for abstracts is now open for the EU DisinfoLab annual conference, which will happen this year on the 6th to 8th of October 2026 in Vilnius, Lithuania. So we invite researchers, practitioners, and experts working on disinformation, information integrity, digital resilience, media literacy, etc., to submit their abstracts for consideration. You can find the submission details, themes, and guidelines on our website. And yeah, we look forward to your contributions and to seeing many of you in Vilnius. About this webinar today, there is a live translation available that you can enable with the subtitles, the caption section as you see on the screen. This webinar is also recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards on YouTube, so where you can also access all the past webinars. For questions, as usual, we'll use Slido and not the Zoom Q&A. You can scan the QR code on the screen and go to slido.com and enter the code #disinfo. We'll come back to your questions during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. To get started, let's warm up with a couple of quick polls using Slido, and we'll see if it works. If you can let us know where you're joining us from today. I see Vilnius already. That's convenient for the conference. I don't know if you can, yeah, Amsterdam as well. The UK, nice. Spain, Poland, the UK as well. Ireland, great. Super. Thank you. And if you can tell us now which sector you represent, you should be able to click now. Mostly NGOs, civil society, other. Media, makes sense. Other, academia, okay, great, thank you. For those who don't know EU DisinfoLab, we are an independent NGO based in Brussels, dedicated to gathering knowledge, conducting research and investigating disinformation campaigns that target the EU, its member states and core values. We also support community building efforts by connecting stakeholders across sectors working on countering disinformation. And we regularly organize these webinars to highlight the work of experts across the counter disinformation field, share knowledge, and improve dialogue across disciplines. So about today's webinar, the session will focus today on an increasingly important issue, which is climate disinformation in mainstream media, and particularly how it circulates on air through television and radio. While much attention is often placed on social media platforms, traditional media still plays a crucial role in shaping public understanding of climate change, influencing perceptions, trust in science, and willingness to support climate action. This makes broadcast and print media not only a key source of information, but also a potential high impact vector for misleading narratives. In this webinar specifically, we will present findings from the report Mapping Climate Disinformation in French and Brazilian Mainstream Media, which was produced by QuotaClimat in partnership with Data for Good and Science Feedback. The research combines advanced monitoring methods with the methodological rigor of fact-checking and highlights how climate disinformation spikes around political and geopolitical moments and how it clusters into recurring narratives, particularly around climate solutions, as we will see, and how media ecosystems differ across national contexts. We are very pleased today to welcome Louna Wemaere from QuotaClimat, who will guide us through the report's methodology, key results and recommendations, including what these findings imply for media accountability and information integrity. So Louna is the EU advocacy officer for the NGO QuotaClimat and serves as knowledge manager on climate disinformation. Louna has also previously worked at the OECD and at the French Ministry for Ecological Transition on environmental public policies. Louna, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Inès, and thank you everyone for being here. Welcome to the presentation of our recent report, Climate Disinformation in Mainstream Media, that was co-produced with Data for Good and Science Feedback, as that was said already. So my name is Louna Wemaere. I'm EU Policy Manager for the NGO QuotaClimat. And yeah, today we're presenting this. So maybe I can take just a few minutes to tell you more about the NGO QuotaClimat. So we have the program on the next slide. So the 30 minutes we have next, we'll do, if we can have the program. Yeah, perfect. So I'll do a small introduction of QuotaClimat so you'll know where I'm speaking from. Then I'll be presenting the data, the results of the report. And then I'll be maybe presenting the French and Brazilian context in which those data and which those results are taking place and the recommendations, because of course there are solutions. This is also the point of this. And then we'll have a Q&A session where I'll be able to answer your questions. So we can go to the first slide, which is about traditional media. So basically, this is the take of QuotaClimat. We are seeing a rising share of climate skepticism, but also major political backlash against environmental policies. It's not only in Europe, but also we're seeing in the US, but also in other OECD countries. And our take with QuotaClimat is that traditional media have a role to play. It's not only us who are saying it, the IPCC is also saying it. Basically, traditional media, print and broadcast, still have a performative effect on public perceptions, on the understanding and willingness to act on climate change. It's both the framing, but also the repeated exposure of climate information, which influences our clarity of climate issues, but also the policy discussion in the media, and then it influences public support in the end. All we know, we're going to come after that, we're going to come through the results, but all we know from academic literature for now is that climate change news really suffer from a low appeal in the media due to a perception of being a complex and unobstructive issues with sometimes threatening dimensions. And on the contrary, when disinformation reaches mainstream media, it's getting normalized. So we'll see how it goes, but maybe first some Eurobarometer results to show you how traditional media is still being massively used at European level. So basically, against like very common ideas, traditional media remains very strong across Europe. This is the Eurobarometer of Social Media Survey 2025. And basically what it says is that 2/3 of respondents still rely on TV, radio, and newspapers to stay informed about social and political current affairs. Television alone, as you see, is reaching 71% of EU citizens. So despite the growth of social media, which enables really like a big availability of information, there's a different, let's say, notion of the reception of this information, because the trust levels between social media and traditional media is very different. When we check traditional media, we have this blind trust effect, which makes it easier to believe this information, to trust this information. So when you check on the next slide, you also have the sense of what's happening in the media about climate change information for the moment. So first of all, we have this issue of just the quantity and quality of information, but then you have the issue of disinformation as well. And now we know that 50% almost of EU citizens find it difficult to differentiate disinformation and information. And then half of EU citizens as well don't think traditional media provides clear information. So there's this dual challenge of we are seeing increasing amounts of disinformation on social media, but also sometimes in traditional media, but also this very low quantity and quality of environmental information, which makes it increasingly difficult to differentiate facts and fiction. So maybe a few words about QuotaClimat. We're a French-based NGO. We're working basically on having a better coverage of the environmental crisis through three levels of action. The first one is producing data and using semi-automated AI models to quantify and qualify media coverage of environmental emergencies. So there's also the monitoring this environmental coverage and then monitoring the amount of disinformation. Then the second one, we call it mobilization or inoculation, but it's basically challenging mainstream media practices. We do it mainly on LinkedIn. We have a community of like 100,000 now people following us, and it's basically making this reputational level way better to use now against media. Talking with media. And then we have the advocacy level, which consists about calling national and international decision makers to take into account the role of the media at EU, but also international level. We're working closely with the CAD Coalition, Climate Action Against Disinformation. Maybe we can, this is already a lot of information, but we'll dig into the concrete stuff. So the results, about those results that have been released after 8 months of analysis from January to July 2025. Basically, the questions we asked ourselves was how, why, and to what extent traditional media are creating or amplifying narratives that antagonize or disinform on climate action. And while the results are quite striking, we really weren't expecting that. So in 8 months of analysis, we found 529 cases of climate misinformation in France. 19 narratives were identified between January and August 2025. We'll come back to the semantics we used. And as Inès said in the introduction, there were really peaks concentrated around key political and geopolitical moments, but we'll see that afterwards on the graph. So maybe on the methodology, this is the next slide exactly. We are defining disinformation and disinformation as it is done in the literature. When you look at the media context, is a bit more complex, let's say, because it's difficult to measure the intentions of journalists or of guests to say some misinformation claims. So every isolated case is defined as a misinformation case, but when there's statistical evidence that many misinformation cases cluster, we call it disinformation narratives, which show basically systemic amplification of this specific claim. We'll see examples afterwards. What I can tell you, what came out of this study is, first of all, that there's a sharp increase in climate misinformation cases in traditional media around key political and geopolitical moments. The ones we really saw that were really important was when Donald Trump took office, which we believe made everyone feel free to share climate skepticism comments. That was really visible in traditional French media, but then there was big debate around energy, which showed really boom in climate misinformation cases. What this really indicates, I think, is that we can anticipate basically peaks of misinformation cases, and really around very high political momentums. So this is already one hint that is coming out from the study. Something you have to know, one data that I think is very interesting, that 41% of climate disinformation over this period, over the Donald Trump taking office, is actually explicitly mentioning Donald Trump. So there's a big link that we can see between really those political momentum and then the narratives that we found in the media. The second result we thought that was really instructive was the ability for some traditional media to actually counter disinformation campaigns and to be less vulnerable. Basically, the direct correlation we find is that the less mainstream radio stations, now we talk about radio. The less mainstream radio stations cover environmental issues, the more vulnerable they are to climate information campaigns. So it really shows that information is actually the biggest counterpower, the biggest bulwark against disinformation. And so it also shows that, on the contrary, low, sporadic, segmented climate coverage is an enabling, permissive factor to the proactive obstruction strategies that certain actors can have. So here you have the key French media we've been analyzing, and so you really see this downward curve showing how the more a media informs, the less misinformation cases we find. On the next slide, you see this is for TV. You can see that this is a result we're actually seeing at European level when you read the studies, but basically that public broadcasting is the biggest watchdog against disinformation diffusion, meaning that this is where we find um, the least of misinformation cases. It is on average 6 times less affected by climate disinformation than the private sector. We're talking about France, of course, and we know that climate disinformation has a kind of strategic elasticity. But we know also that today's watchdogs are not necessarily tomorrow's ones. And this is why we need regulatory frameworks that make sure that everyone is on the same page. But still, this is quite instructive when we look, we trying to find like really fit for purpose recommendations while protecting resources for the public sector to act on this information and to have really like expert journalists is actually a really good lever. I think the next one is very interesting in terms of what is targeted by disinformation narratives in France. This is also validated in the literature, but basically we're seeing a shift from all climate denial, saying that climate change basically doesn't exist, to the new climate denial, mainly targeting the solutions. In France, this is a lot about the renewables, renewable energy. So first of all, you see in this graph that 90% of disinformation that we found relates to climate solutions and action, and 64% relates directly to energy, and particularly to renewable energy. The other aspect that I think is important to notice is that the biggest majority of disinformation campaigns that we've been notifying were observed on the first quarter of 2025, meaning that they don't recycle themselves that much. So it's easy to anticipate for journalists when you know what's circulating, what's being used by political leaders, but also that it's like disinformation campaigns are not really creative when we're talking about traditional media. Not, of course, this analysis is not about social media, but this is really good to know. So on the next slide, I think you have this taxonomy, basically cartography of the most recurring disinformation narratives. So meaning this is where we have the biggest quantity of misinformation cases that always come back the same. The biggest, as I was saying, the biggest slot is about solutions relating to energy, especially renewable energy. The strategic elasticity of disinformation makes it obvious that it's the combination of really sensationalist, emotion-based discourses relating, for example, to the price of living, and then to really the energy and economic sectors that are really powerful in France. So both of them, you kind of see the combination of this on those narratives. But really having the balance between all of them, I think is really important, not only for media but also for citizens to understand where really the obstruction strategies are really taking place. I know I only have 10 minutes left, so I'll try to go quite quick on the last slides. This one, I think, is also nice because when we're talking about disinformation in traditional media, first of all, it's quite a sensitive topic, not because we live in a democracy, and freedom of expression and freedom of the press is a core principle of democracy. So when we're trying to have a like efficient regulatory framework and efficient also incentives, it's important to know where it's coming from. And this is why we have analyzed basically who is spreading disinformation. Is it basically journalists or editorial, like editor-in-chiefs, or is it guests? And the difference between public and private sector is quite strong when you look at France. Um, Audiovisual media, basically in the private sector, you see that 46% of cases are pronounced by journalists or columnists themselves, which basically asks them the questions about, well, the willingness, the intentions, and also the training of journalists on complex environmental issues. And then, in contrast, in the public sector, is mainly guessed, whether political or not, which account for 92% of the cases identified. So on, I think on the last one, on the last slides of results, what we see is what we've tried to do is basically to map media, mainstream media, according to their porosity to climate misinformation cases. And we're really seeing that this is according to editorial choices. We've divided into three categories. The first one is proactive relays of disinformation. Basically, we're guessing this is really a distinctive posture to have climate skeptic narratives on their shows. Then you have permissive vectors, which have average cases of misinformation quantity, and then watchdogs, again, disinformation. I was telling you about the public sector, which is quite prevalent in this category. But still, this shows how mainstream media is not a monolithic package. They can either be the problem or the solution. And I think this is worth saying it, because disinformation is not, how do you say that, inevitable. It shows also that if you have editorial willingness to actually tackle the problem, but also enough resources to do it, it is actually possible to let it, like, to have quite good results about disinformation, fact checking, and contradiction also. Well, my the goal was to also present you what's happening in Brazil, because this report, and I'll encourage you to dig into the report whenever this webinar is finished, because there's way more results and explanations of the results. I think it's quite quite interesting. What we saw with Brazil is very, very different than France. It's basically detected misinformation is basically 3 to 6 times less prevalent than France. Mainly because environmental issues receive very little media coverage and is often presented in a misleading, neutral way. This is in part explained by, well, lack of media coverage, but also other things like the influence of dominant economic sectors, agribusiness, mining, and the intertwining of media and political actors. If you want more information, again, there's a historical context explanation in the report that is very key to understand all of this. Then for the last 10 minutes, I'll take just a few minutes to cover the context, and this is on the next slide, especially for France, because you've seen a lot of numbers for France. So I believe it'll be more interesting to see how this materialize. This is well, this is, I don't know if you see it very concretely because it's written in small, but we done this causal chain because I feel like sometimes systemic problems appear like very difficult to tackle, since you see problems like there are issues in the production of disinformation, then the diffusion of disinformation, then the consequences of disinformation. And so we at QuotaClimat have made a decision to really focus on traditional media, which we seen as the end goal of disinformation strategies when it comes to normalize them. But it's important to take into account that, yeah, it's very key to have organizations working on making fossil actors accountable for the obstruction strategies they're using, but also um, actors working on the democratic risks of disinformation. On the next slide, we see that no, so the one just before. I think this is a point to make because when we're talking about disinformation, I think it's worth noting that there are active forces of obstruction. We're talking about the architects, sometimes the proxies, which actually profit from that, meaning, for example, big tech. But there are also permissive enabling conditions that make allow disinformation to circulate. We listed four, this is a non-exhaustive list, of course. We listed four factors in France. The influence of emitting sectors on the public framing of the debate, the extreme right, which is on the right and opportunistically using anti-climate narratives for the moment. But we also have on the other side, this is what we're working a lot on, structural deficiencies in the dealing with environmental issues in the media also getting lacking resources as advertising is shifting a lot to platforms. I think this is a key a key to understand how to combat disinformation. This is, we need to have a dual approach between improving the quality and the quantity of information on the one hand, and on the other hand having this detecting and monitoring and adaptive capacity to tackle disinformation on the other hand. When you look at the consequences, which is the next slide, we're talking about France only. It's very concrete. So disinformation is not only disinformation on climate is not only a discursive issue. It really does have material consequences on the long term. And the first one that we see is the blurring public perceptions that it creates. For example, in France, you have 70% now are French citizens which actually believe that the thermal how do you say thermal cars are actually as no, electric cars are actually as polluting as thermal cars. So this is actually the consequence of a long-term communication strategy also from the automobile industry, and also the sense of urgency, we see it in the polls, is actually decreasing in France when we talk about the climate crisis, which is completely contradictory with science, basically. The second consequence we're seeing is the weakening of legislative work. This is not something that is not as abstract as we could see it, because we have actually traced how basically a fake news in public debate in France that was related to the blackout in Spain and the theoretically what they called non-efficacy of renewable energy sources. We actually led to a legislative work from right politicians saying in a draft bill that renewable energies were inefficient enough, and so we should stop their development. So this is really the end goal of disinformation strategies. This is also said by the IP International Panel on Information Integrity, that strategic skepticism is actually targeting decision makers first and not really the citizens. And then you have the economic, of course, and industrial uncertainty, which decreases the investments that are necessary for the environmental transition, the net zero goals we have to achieve before 2030 and 2050. So that was I think that was it for France. This is a lot of information already. The next slides were supposed to be about the context in Brazil, but again, this is the information is listed in the report, and then the recommendation was basically if we want to go to the end of the presentation. Yeah, here it is. What we are saying with QuotaClimat is that there are many levers we can activate if we want to mitigate and anticipate the problem of disinformation. But really, I think what we're seeing is that we're entering into an era of systemic vulnerabilities. And so, under these conditions, we cannot only use approaches that solely focus on post crisis communication or fact checking. It's insufficient. So information integrity needs to be integrated into preparedness and strategic planning. Um, to make sure we're resilient enough. So we have this really like three-stage governance process with preparation, shock management, resilience, and all the levers you're seeing on the slides, like cooperation, media literacy, protecting the integrity of journalists, strengthening the legal and regulatory framework. All of this is important not only to stimulate our critical thinking, but also to stabilize our trust in in sources of information. So that was it. Thank you so much for your attention. I am now more than happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Luna, for this very insightful presentation and for sharing these concrete findings and recommendations. I shared in the chat the report for people to have a look after the webinar. We can now open the floor for your questions. So we have around 20 minutes for discussion. Just a reminder to submit the questions via Slido and not the Zoom Q&A. You can scan the QR code, which is on the screen now, and head to slido.com and enter hashtag disinfo. We should be able to see the questions in a minute on the screen. Yes. I'll start with the first one we see. In your comparative analysis, what structural or political factors explain differences in climate coverage between France and Brazil?
So you mean the differences, well, I guess you mean the differences between France and Brazil. Well, it's it's very interesting actually. What we're seeing in France is really that we have achieved a certain level of awareness on the issue, and now the debate is more the political and media debate is more focusing on the solutions. Um, the solutions we relate more on the energy and automobile side. For the moment, there's also agricultural debates. Um, what I can tell you is that basically on this strategic elasticity thing of disinformation narratives is that all every comparison we make and all the disinformation narratives we identified in every country is always defined by two things, like the preoccupations of the citizens in the country. So as I was saying, the price of living is a big one. There's also security, and the second one is the industry, the prevalent industry players in this country. So the in Brazil, the big influence of agribusiness and basically the fact that agribusiness actually has a lot of media and is a big players in the media ecosystem, it's acting on the fabrication, on the production of environmental information at the source. So this is why we have low quantity of information and it's presented at the root in the media in a misleading, neutral way, a depoliticized way, in a way. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. We can jump to the second one, which is also about France and Brazil. I guess I understand it as which climate myth is the most effective, yeah, in each country, not because it's believable, but because it's emotionally irresistible for each context. I understand.
That's a very good question. Actually, we're not measuring the reception of the disinformation narratives. So we I couldn't tell you this is also a social psychology question. Um, I wouldn't be capable of telling you which one was the most effective. My intuition is that for example the renewable energy narrative, the one that it's saying that it's costing too much money, um, is actually very effective, and it's so effective that it has been reused and reused and reused more than 100 times in the media. And this is also because political or economic actors, they use it as a distinctive posture, and it's working for the audiences on those media. For example, the media, they are the more allowed to say it would be CNews and Sud Radio, where you have the biggest quantity of cases like this, and this is also an editorial choice to stand out on those questions. Um, but yeah, so we'll see in the end about the effectiveness of those narratives. But this is actually a really good question. But for just to make sure we are on the same methodological ground, it's disinformation narratives. We don't call it climate myth. As disinformation, we really say that it's not founded. It's not founded, or it's actually false. But a climate myth is something that we find more on social media when it's related to conspiracy theories.
Yeah, thank you for the distinction. Very important. Another question is related to the how do misleading claims, narratives about energy prices or electric vehicles, for example, affect public trust in climate policy and the green transition?
Um, what I can tell you about France, because the results in Brazil are really preliminary, and we've worked with a lot of experts, but I think we would need to do a more in-depth analysis to know all the causes and effects. But what I can tell you in France is that, well, we're seeing, I don't know if it's a direct correlation or if it's an indirect consequence from increase in disinformation claims in the media, but as I was telling you, there's misleading public perceptions of instruments of the transition, for example, electric vehicles, which are perceived as polluting as other vehicles. And so people are less and less inclined to accept the changes, the structural transformations of those solutions. There's an OECD study showing that basically the public acceptability of solutions is conditioned by two things: the perceived fairness and the perceived efficiency of the solution. So when you talk about perception, perceived fairness, perceived efficacy, it's going through the media a lot. So it's how the traditional media, how also on social media it is presented, because we depend on the information we receive. So basically, if we have increasing disinformation narratives about those two items, which also symbolize kind of a part of our freedom when we talk about vehicles, for example, it's for sure that they will resonate more than other subjects. When when it's just the correct, like the direct correlation is really difficult to measure, but what we're seeing is that basically the sense of urgency is decreasing, and that people are less and less inclined to be interested in like solutions of the transition. So this is what I can tell you about this, but we need more studies between media coverage, increasing disinformation, and then the public acceptability of some public measures.
Thank you. Great. To what extent do broadcasters amplify climate disinformation inadvertently versus through deliberate framing or editorial choices?
Well, um, uh, well, this is also that was the point of our analysis on the how do you say, like the people, the speakers, the distribution of speakers on this information, that makes the distinction between journalists and between guests. Um, so far, what has been indicated is that in the public sector is mostly inadvertent. Basically, like measuring the intention is impossible. So even saying it that in the private sector it's intentional would be fake. Well, it's not. I cannot prove it so far, and it would be obstructing several factors that happen inside the broadcasters' redactions, meaning like there's pressure from editorial boards, there's pressure for also from um, the people who actually own the medias. So what I can tell you is that I hope a lot is actually inadvertent, but when you see systemic amplification, it means that there are not enough dissuasion mechanisms in those broadcasters to debunk climate disinformation live. So this is really what we're saying with QuotaClimat is that um, there are like many journalists actually come to us saying that they don't have enough resources or enough time to train on climate, on environmental issues, which are increasingly complex. So it really depends on editorial choices, but also like strong constraints that journalists suffer from. But the intention we can really trace from is when it's spoken from journalists themselves, and it's pretty much the case on media like CNews and Sud Radio in France.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Based on your findings, what evidence threshold would be needed to classify climate disinfo as a systemic risk under the DSA?
Well, this is a good question. This is what we've been trying to do with the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition for 2 years almost, and I think well there were people who were documenting the threat before us, but so the systemic risk category under the DSA doesn't explicitly refer to climate disinformation. We could, on the contrary, say that it actually checks all the boxes for being considered as a systemic risk. There's also something else that is important to know is that, so basically, every year, digital services boards of every member state need to hand out their um, perspectives on systemic risks that they have been documenting in their member states. And this year it was published, I believe, in November. And this year the climate emergencies were defined as a prospective systemic risks. So to answer your question, what we need, I believe, would be data. I think it's always the same when you ask EU institutions is you need to show the proportionality, the legitimacy and the proportionality of your threats. Um, and so you need to have enough evidence that it is happening in all member states, and you need to have evidence that it represents a threat. So we are actually doing this work of data production in a few member states, Belgium, France, soon Germany, Poland. So we'll be doing this work, but it takes a long time to make sure we have like a formal recognition. And on the side, also this is important. The EU actually signed the Declaration on Information and on Integrity on climate change that was launched at COP30. So this is also like a good step forward for like a formal recognition of the threat of climate disinformation.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I just selected a question on COP30 as you mentioned it. So COP30 in Brazil was described as the COP of truth with the first ever declaration on information integrity on climate. In your view, did the summit genuinely elevate the fight against climate disinfo to a core climate policy priority or not?
Mm, well, this is the hope. Yeah, it's the first time ever we're talking about information integrity as a transversal and systemic issue that is actually a precondition to successful climate action. So I think this is a milestone in the fight against climate disinformation. What is very good news is the global initiative, like beyond the declaration, there's the initiative that was launched by the UNESCO and the Brazilian presidency, and that is actually has actually created this fund, global fund, to then finance initiatives working on integrity of information. So we have the finance bit, which could be implemented soon. Then you have the declaration, which calls for implementation at national levels to protect information integrity. So we're making progress, and now the let's say the next step is really to be well to have implementation, to make progress, to make sure more countries join the initiative, but to also to make sure the countries which signed are actually implementing measures to protect information integrity.
Thank you. Yeah, a long way to go still. Climate is a complex issue to grasp. What criteria did you use to label content as climate disinformation, scientific consensus, fact-checking sources, or a coding framework?
That's a big question, but it's a very good one still. Well, we are. I feel like the word disinformation is really sensitive, and it should be because well, still we it's living in cohabitation with freedom of expression, especially when talking about media. So we are working with a fact-checking partner called Science Feedback. Um, I've explained it at the beginning of the presentation how we label content as climate misinformation. I Let me remind you that all cases are labeled as misinformation cases and not disinformation. Disinformation are really narratives when we see clusters. Um, and all of the it's really like every case is investigated by the fact checking. They are, by the way, labeled by the EFSCN and the International Fact Checking Network as well. So if you want to know everything about them fact checking methodology, and especially for this one, everything is explained in the report, but also on their website. So that will be easier this way, I believe.
Yes, perfect. Another question, if you could explain which program format are more associated with climate disinfo, news segments, talk shows, call-in radio, or political commentary?
Yeah, well, this is also like an interesting bit. Well, what we're seeing is that it's mainly live shows who are the most vulnerable to disinformation. It's a quite simple explanation. It's because basically um, journalists don't have time to fact check live everything the guests are saying. And this is where like it's most likely to happen. Um, News segment would be maybe the less likely. It's more or less when there is debate. We also have this new infotainment shift in France because of yeah, well, media ecosystem transformation, mainly because a lot of well some billionaires are buying a new or buying audiovisual media also as a strategy of influence, and because it is less costly, they are buying media and then they're removing the information production programs, and they're basically just replacing it with like opinion talks. So this is also a place where a lot of disinformation can circulate and where it's not contradicted, because this is also like a important notion to have in mind when we are labeling content as misinformation case. It is when it's not contradicted live. So if the journalist is able to answer or to say something, we are not counting it in our analysis.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you for this. Another question now, are there examples of effective broadcast practices that reduce climate misinfo?
Well, everyone is looking now for good practices to protect information integrity, and thank God. Well, this makes sense. Um, as I was saying, this is a dual challenge to me, and the analysis shows that the more a broadcaster, the more like a TV or a radio has like a good quantity and quality range of environmental information, the less it is vulnerable to climate disinformation. So this is something, first of all, to have in mind is that if you have journalists that are sufficiently trained on climate information, but also to debunk climate disinformation, they have resources to do it. I would say this is a good practice to counter climate disinformation narratives, live especially. Um, on the other hand, there are many fact-checking programs that have been launched in a lot of media. The BBC has a lot of experts, not only working on AI generated content, but also on every topic that is vulnerable to disinformation. So having like fact checking cells, I think, is also like a key response. Um, when I'm answering your question only for like internal media recommendation, but I think when we're talking about disinformation, especially on climate, we need to have really a more structural perspective, um, to make sure that it's not only the media that have to be voluntary to implement voluntary practices, but also that we have this regulatory frameworks to make sure, like on social media as well, but in the public debate, everyone is, there's no incentive to do disinformation at least. So yeah. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
you go ahead.
very interesting point. Thank you. Next question, good one. Given everything happening, global wars, economic crisis, political polarization, etc., do you see a risk that climate change drops out of public attention, not because people deny it, but because they feel overwhelmed or disillusioned?
Yeah, this is a probable outcome. Well, yes and no. It's interesting when you look at the studies, like at the polls of public opinion regarding information. So there's for sure there's a fatigue, information fatigue, and I feel like everyone is suffering from it, um, and well, there's also something that has to be taken into account, and I'm not neglecting it, is that we're seeing inequalities and poverty also rising. So we know that in public perceptions, environmental crises are a long-term issue and not short-term, and so they just like deprioritize it whenever economic short-term concerns are in front of them. So this is something I wanted to say. But on the more positive note, when you look at polls, people want positive news, but also more local news. And I think there's nothing more local than environmental issues and solutions. Um, when you look at the um, let's say categories medias are covering, everything, a lot of the coverage is focusing on the consequences basically and not on the solution. We have really like a low media coverage of the solutions, which would actually be actionable information, but also like kind of positive and a very let's say, yeah, concrete information that should could be given to the people, well, to the people, to citizens, to know more about how to act on it. So I think this is also something not to be too desperate on, is that actually people are really eager for more solution-based information and positive information. And I think it does exist on climate change. It's also a matter of like editorial practices and what is perceived from the media as wanted from the citizens.
Yes, thank you. And related to that question, the first question highlighted, do you think climate disinfo today is increasingly about demobilization, pushing people into cynicism by highlighting that major emitters keep polluting, so individual actions feels pointless? It's connected to what you were saying now.
Um, yeah, completely. I think cynicism is really like maybe I don't know if it would be the main point of disinformation strategy, but it's definitely one of the objective, because it's I would say is the biggest enemy to dialogue and to action. Cynicism makes you think that nothing is possible anymore and that everything is lost. Um, I don't know if the kind of narrative that is circulating in the media is really pushing for demobilization. I would say it's pushing for structural delays. That's for sure. The demobilization side is really a side effect. Um, and it's a side effect, but more from a collective point of view. I feel like on as a how would I say that? Um, I feel like individual narratives are way like more pushed by also it was documented like the carbon individual carbon footprint was actually invented by polluters by the fossil industry to make sure we divert attention from the structural and the industry emissions from the individual action. So I feel like a lot of individual narratives have been pushed the last years, and I don't it sure increases cynicism because we feel like the problem is not moving well, we are not resolving the problem, and that what we're doing is actually sometimes seen as a how do you say like moralizing, but not really successful. So it's for sure it's not helping.
Yeah. Thank you. And maybe a quick last question. Do you see climate narrative being used as part of a broader geopolitical influence strategy, for example, to weaken EU cohesion on energy transition policies?
Yeah, that is something that is documented by EU vs Disinfo. There is one page that was published that is actually published in and yeah, published by the EAS, so the external uh, action services from the European Union, and they are documenting the fact that narratives saying that, for example, the Green Deal is a tool to a colonial tool to stop the development of, for example, vulnerable countries or Eastern countries, especially regarding energy transition, because energy security is for sure a priority in many countries. So this is like a good neuralgic point on to touch on when you want to make disinformation. So yeah, well, we were talking about the architects of disinformation. Russia is for sure one of them. It could be seen as a strategic or opportunity strategy. You call it as you want it. There is a part of like delaying the decarbonization path of EU for sure, but also a part about like weakening democratic institutions also to make sure we're not moving forward on anything. So yeah, this is something that we're seeing, and they're one of the biggest pioneers of climate disinformation. When FIMI is Russia, China, Iran for some of them, and we're increasingly seeing the US, even though the EU is still struggling to call them as FIMI actors, but we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much, Luna. Very, very interesting points. And we got some really nice questions and many. So that brings us to the end of today's session. A huge thank you again for sharing all of your insights and for the audience to staying until the end. Many thanks as well to my colleagues Anna and Heini for their support behind the scenes. And before we close, a quick reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. Reminder as well to read the reports by QuotaClimat. And don't miss as well our upcoming webinars that you see on the screen. The next one is next week with the University of Goldsmiths, who is most vulnerable to AI-generated disinformation, psychological drivers of media literacy and belief in harmful online content. Sorry, it's a long title. And another one with DigiClimat and Tactical Tech, Scroll, Stop, Verify, how the EU is bringing climate facts forward. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you all very soon, online or in person at our annual conference in Vilnius this October. Thank you and have a great rest of the day. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.